Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So as we have been walking through this overview on the Pentateuch, we have come to the book of Numbers. So Numbers, they call it Numbers because they number the people. The first few chapters, they actually go through and list the number of people in each tribe, the number of men that are 20 and above that are able to go to war. So they're sizing the tribes. They're trying to figure out what they have for military, actually, because the plan is at this point that they are going to go into the land of Canaan and they're going to have to fight. They don't want to send women and children in there. And then they also go through in chapter 3, actually, as a quick note. Let me put that up. As a quick note here, let's see. In Numbers 3, 12 and 13, God tells Moses, "Now behold, I myself have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel instead of every firstborn who opens the womb among the children of Israel. Therefore the Levites shall be mine, because," verse 13, "all the firstborn are mine. On the day that I struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I sanctified to myself, or separated to myself, all the firstborn in Israel, both man and animal or beast," right? "They shall be mine. I am the Lord." Now, God did that. However, he ended up replacing, and it goes through and explains that in some later verses, he replaced all the firstborn with Levites. And then there was a disparity of numbers between them, and then the extra people that were not able to be covered by the Levites were paid, and because the numbers weren't exact, the number of firstborn, the number of Levites, so they paid the redemption money for the ones that were left over. And the whole idea is that God is being represented by this tribe of Levi as opposed to pulling the firstborn out. But the firstborn is always belonging to God. It's like the first fruits, the first of everything. And so they end up receiving the Levites in place of the other firstborn. So this ends up kind of laying out a pattern. But after they lay that out, they go through and they explain what the different families in the Levitical tribe, what the responsibilities will be and everything else. Only Aaron's family within the Levitical tribe will be offering sacrifices and all that. So but anyways, that's kind of like how Numbers starts off. It's why it's called Numbers. So as we walk through this, really Numbers is learning obedience to the Lord. But we need to recognize some key people that appear in Numbers before we kind of get into the overall. And Moses obviously is God's choice for the leader, right? That's important to remember because that leadership is going to be challenged. Aaron, who's Moses' brother, Miriam, his sister. The mixed multitude come up in chapter 11. They are people that came out with the Jews that were not Jews. They were Egyptians or some other that had enough faith to come out, but were always kind of creating somewhat of an issue. Joshua, who was Moses' assistant, he was one of the two faithful spies in the land, and him and Caleb, right, the second faithful spy. And then in chapter 16, we find Korah, who is of the Levitical tribe. He feels as though he, in his rebellion, should have a place just like Moses. Why shouldn't he be in Moses' place. He's just as qualified. Well, the issue is that God didn't pick him. So God had to choose a leader. And, it's interesting now that they're underway. They're out of Egypt. They're in the wilderness. They got the law. Now, here's where the confrontations come to God's selection of leaders. And Moses did not pick himself to be a leader. God picked him. And, of course, it's going to be challenged. Now, the interesting thing is that Korah went and unfortunately, you see this in churches from time to time where somebody is disgruntled at the pastor and then they get a posse together and they somehow convince all the other people that are not very wise to go with them, take their sides, go to the pastor, and then they all kind of fight against the pastor, sometimes causing a church division. Well, this is what Korah did. He went to some of the leaders of Israel, said, hey, why should Moses take all this on himself? Who does he think he is? We're just disqualified. Well, the issue was between Korah and God, right? Moses was just, he was just the guy that was chosen. He didn't put himself in the position. But when you have somebody that's disgruntled, a lot of lessons can be learned from Korah, unfortunately. And we get to a king called Sihon. He was from Heshbon and was a very powerful king, right? We also see Og. He was from Bashan. Now, Og was a big guy. He had a 13-foot iron bed, so he was a giant. And Israel defeats these two nations, basically. They didn't want to fight them. There was no need for it. But, later on near the end of Numbers, we see Balaam come into the mix. Next guy here, that's Balak, the king of Moab. And then Balaam, he's a false prophet who basically is hired by Balak, the king of Moab, to curse Israel because as they were moving through the wilderness, Sihon came out to battle them. They didn't want any trouble. The Jews didn't, but Sihon attacked them. God defeated Sihon. Same thing with Og. Well, when the king of Moab saw this, Balak, he said, well, we couldn't defeat Sihon and we couldn't defeat Og. Israel beat both of them, so I better get somebody to take care of them in the spiritual domain, before they become a physical problem. And so he hired Balaam, and, we'll get to that. So the overview of Numbers it's easiest to understand if you look at it based on locations. So here's a map of when they crossed over, and they're at Mount Sinai for the first, they're actually at Mount Sinai during the book of Leviticus. They're receiving the law still. They're still there. And then this would be the first location we find them in the book of Numbers. Then they travel. They kind of move their tents. And in chapter 10, they begin to move, and then they end up in the wilderness of Paran, which is here, and they stay there through chapter 19. They travel again in chapter 20 and 21, and then they finally end up the top there at Moab, prior to going into the land, because after the book of Numbers is Deuteronomy, and that's where Moses will deal with the final generation that's going to enter into the land. So as we look at this, we look at Numbers. Now, when we ended Leviticus, the cloud came down. Or when we began Leviticus, the cloud come down. They had made the tabernacle, ended at the end of Exodus. The cloud come down, filled the tabernacle. They couldn't go in. They go through Leviticus. They learn all the prescribed method for worshiping God, prescribed by him. they follow that, and then when we get to the beginning of Numbers, they're now in the tabernacle because they followed those orders. So as we see here, from chapter 1 to chapter 10, verse 9, where they're still at Sinai, the people get numbered. They take a census, setting the order of the camp, with the ark, right, which is where God's presence was, at the center, and then the tribes would be around it, okay? And in these first few chapters, we find out what tribes are, east, west, north, and south, how they're laid out, and which is the leading tribe, because you get 12 tribes, you get 3 of each, and the first tribe mentioned is the leading of the 3 tribes in each of those locations. So this is how it would lay out, for east, west, north, and south. Judah, obviously, on top is the main tribe of those 3, Reuben, and then Naphtali and Benjamin. So that's how they kind of lay out. The Levites, they were associated just with the tabernacle. So we have the tabernacle, and if you can see on the right, the little picture there, the cartoon, would give you an idea, that's supposed to be, Moses and Joshua are overlooking the nation, and that's how they would lay out. Actually, Reuben, Ephraim would be the leading tribe on the west, and Dan would be on the north. So that's how it would actually lay out for the primary one. So they set the marching order for the nation to travel, right? The Judah would start out first, and then they would work their way on through. This is how the order would fall. So you have the ark, you have Judah after them, and then Gershon and Merari. They would follow with basically all the, like, what makes up the tabernacle. Then Reuben, that group, and then the tabernacle furniture with the Kohathites. And again, these are tribe names within the Levitical tribe that were responsible, and then you got the last 2 groups of 3 following at the end. The priests and the people were sanctified through various purification laws for their journey to the promised land. They haven't got there yet, right? So they journey, and then it takes them 3 days, and then they complain. So in chapter 11, Miriam and Aaron complain. Actually, that's in 12. In 11, we have the mixed multitude complaining in chapter 12 about, Moses' leadership and, what God's doing. Miriam and Aaron, they oppose Moses. And again, they're his brother and sister, but they oppose him. And then Miriam is judged with leprosy, indicating she was probably the leader, being the older sister. And then that's taken care of in chapter 12. Moses, again, he intercedes for the complainers. He intercedes for his brother and sister. They have to wait for Miriam. She has to spend time outside the camp because it is the ritual of leprosy when it gets healed. And then Israel moves to Paran. So then now they're in the wilderness of Paran, chapter 13, right? They send the 12 spies to scout out the land, right? They don't get a good report back from 10 of them. The people believe them, so they start their 40 years of wandering. So this is in chapter 13. Chapter 14, there was rebellion. They wanted to replace Moses because, again, they didn't like what they saw in the land. They said there's giants. Yes, it's true that God gave us a land of milk and honey, and they brought out these grapes that had to have a big rod, and they were carrying them between people. They must have been enormous clusters, and so there was none of that was incorrect. However, they said we're like grasshoppers in their sight. Now, there were giants in the land. They were large people. Satan had placed them in there to try to prevent Israel from going into the land, because if they don't have the land that they can settle in, they can't get established, can't build a temple, can't keep genealogies. In other words, they're not established as a nation. They're nothing but Bedouins, and that's not God's plan for bringing the Word of God and the Messiah of God into the land, into the world. So Korah's rebellion, chapter 16, Aaron's rod buds in 17, showing that, validating again, Aaron is the priest, after Korah's rebellion. And you should read these, as opposed to me storytelling the entire thing. It's good for you to read it on your own. So after they're judged, then God says, okay, I made my choice of Moses. I'm going to show you who now is the priesthood, right? The ones that are going to offer sacrifice. Have everybody put, one from each tribe, put their rod at the door of the tabernacle. When they went back the next day, it was only Aaron's rod that had budded with almonds. And so God chose Aaron. In other words, these are God's choices. And then the purification and the red heifer. Now, the red heifer purification was designed because as they were going through the wilderness now, God was not going to just take the life from all these people that had no faith to go in the land. They're still believers, okay? However, he was going to graciously give them the opportunity to live out their life in the wilderness, though it was going to be an unproductive life and a monotonous life and all that. It was a judgment against them because of their unbelief. It was the consequences of them not following what God called them to do. Okay. And there were going to be so many people dying over these 40 years in the wilderness. I mean, technically at this point, it'll end up being 38, but over these 40 years, which is the number of judgment, that they needed a faster way to be able to perform a ritual so that people that were touching dead bodies and everything else were not, they'd be waiting for people, they'd never be able to move. Okay. So the red heifer purification was enacted to enable them. God allowed them to be purified in that way. So they journey in chapter 20 to 21 again. The people complain, and Moses, in unbelief, fails to trust God, strikes the rock. Now, earlier, Moses had struck the rock. The people asked for water, and God said to strike the rock. People are thirsty. They need water. The rock split, and the water came out. At this point in time, I don't know if it was that Moses was having a bad day or getting tired of listening to the complainers, but he misrepresented God here. And God said, just speak to the rock and the water will come out. They're thirsty. Well, Moses got frustrated, hit the rock a second time. Now, the people thought that God was angry at them. God was not angry at the people. But in Moses' misrepresentation, he was not allowed to enter into the promised land. Now, we talk about types and examples and everything. The law can never bring you into a place of rest. The promised land is supposed to be a place of rest, right? It's kind of an example of, in the Christian life, of a person that is resting in Christ and productive. Is there battling? Absolutely. Are there enemies that try to come in? Absolutely. It's a constant fight, but it's a great blessing at the same time. It always takes battle to have peace. And that's a difficult thing at times for Christians to understand. A lot of Christians think that, well, if I'm walking with God, then everything is just going to work perfectly, and that's what faith means. That's actually the opposite. You don't need faith when everything's working perfectly. It's kind of like submission, right? Submission is voluntarily exercised, right? And when a person submits, they do it voluntarily. If they're getting along with the person that they're, in this submissive relationship to, then it's great, right? The only time it takes faith to submit is when things are not going well, and then you have to submit. So it's the same with difficulty and battle and everything else, spiritual battle. It's always there. It may lie dormant for a while, but it's nonetheless always there in the Christian life in this world. And that's what the promised land reveals to us as a type or a shadow or a picture. We see the Israelites in there. They're fighting. They're tremendously blessed. They walk with God. They are growing in their understanding of who God is. They don't do well. I mean, they do well at times, then they don't do well, depending upon the king and what's happening in the circumstances. However, the point is that it's not a picture of heaven. There's no battling in heaven. People aren't dying in heaven, but in the promised land, they do. But either way, Moses misrepresents God at the rock. The law cannot bring us into rest, in a sense. Moses also restricted from entering the land. And then the people again complain, despising the manna. God judges with a plague. Moses again intercedes, making the serpent of brass, obeying God's instructions that if they look to it, the poisonous snakes will not kill them. They'll be healed. So again, Jesus takes this and explains it in John chapter 3 as the same principle of looking to him on the cross by faith. And then Sihon and Og are defeated. So now the last few chapters, they're in the plains of Moab. Balak, the king of Moab, employs Balaam, false prophet, to curse Israel. Balaam tries to curse Israel from 3 different locations, but can only prophesy blessing. He utters prophecies of the Messiah's reign, and we see this. The Messiah's reign is Genesis 49 from the tribe of Judah, but this is in chapters 22 through 24. Israel falls to Baal worship. Now, in chapter 31, the 31 here is really showing that the problem was Balaam could not curse Israel. However, it's interesting that it tells us that Balaam instructed Balak how to get God to judge his own people. In other words, you get the girls that are Moabites to attract the Jewish men, bring them in to show them how they worship their gods, which are mostly had some form of sex related to it. So they're all, they're eating meat sacrificed to idols, they're fornicating, and then God is then judging his own people. A guy named Phinehas, who was he was a Levite, he raised up and finally, followed some couple that went to a tent and put a javelin through both of them, and that stopped the plague. Okay, so it's just interesting how even though Balaam could not directly curse Israel, he did find a sneaky way to get told Balak how to get them to sin and have God deal with them. Now, it's interesting, you get into the book of Revelation, and it's, I think it's either the church of Pergamos or Thyatira, where they're teaching the doctrine of Balaam, right? The people are taught to eat things sacrificed to idols and commit fornication. So, same concept brought over into some aspects of the church, and we see that through church history in some of the churches as we look back. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe Manasseh decide they want to settle outside the land. They like the land outside of the Jordan River. It's good for cattle. In other words, it's good for business. They liked it. They liked the grazing area and everything else. Moses allowed them to stay outside as long as they went into battle and helped them settle the land before they stayed on the outside, which is interesting because for the sake of business, in a sense, they were willing to leave their families vulnerable to attack while they were not home. And they didn't have the natural defense of the Jordan River for somebody attacking. Their families were basically just kind of open prey almost for any other nation or tribe that would come along and try to defeat them. But they were willing to do that because business was important to them. But they did go into the land. They finished it. It did cause some problems. You can read about it near the end of Numbers, where they wanted to erect, this little thing of stones as a reminder to the future generations why some of the, 2.5 tribes were outside the land, and the tribes in the land, they said, oh, they're building a false altar. They almost went to war over it. This is part of the problem when you have some people that kind of follow God's program and some that, it doesn't mean that it is entirely out of God's will, but it's like you're not really going with what God's best is, and it creates confusion, right? So a lot of lessons here, right? And then finally you get some laws and vows at the end. Now, as we look into some of the detail for each of these chapters, the census, right? We have a genealogical enrollment and a muster of the adult males, right? And then the rest of chapter 1, the Levites are exempted from the census and assigned to the tabernacle service. We have the order of encampment, which we saw the picture of. The sons of Aaron are consecrated. The Levites subordinated to Aaron. All the Levites, they're given to Aaron, his family, in a sense, to serve them, right? Because they were the only ones that offered sacrifice. The Levites substituted for the firstborn, which we talked about. Then the numbering of the Levites, the different families within the Levitical tribe. The census of the firstborn males of the Israelites, and then the supernumerary firstborn redeemed. We talked about that. The numbers weren't equal between the number of Levites and the number of firstborn, so the offset number needed to be paid for with redemption money, essentially. There was an age limit to service for the Levites. It was 20 years old and up, and I think it went up to 55, if I remember correctly. The service of the sons of Kohath, Gershon, and Merari, their families within the Levitical tribe, and then the census of competent Levites is laid out. So we have the removal of unclean from the camp in chapter 5. We find a restitution for trespasses, also in chapter 5. The ordeal for a suspected wife, and this would be with Levites. The law of the Nazarite comes in chapter 6. If somebody wants to offer themselves voluntarily to restrict themselves for a time, they're not to come near anything from the vine, which represents joy in this life, right? And they're supposed to stay away from, dead things. They're supposed to let their hair grow, which is the symbol of their consecration. And then it was typically temporary. They do it for a time as a real consecration to the Lord. And then at the end of it, they would cut their hair, offer it as a sacrifice and everything else. We get into, the book of Judges and Samson, one of the last. We find that, he didn't lose his strength. The Spirit didn't depart from him until his hair was cut, because it was a canceling of his consecration, though he was to be a lifelong Nazirite. Again, whole nother story. Former priestly blessing at the end of Numbers 6, we get that, right? the Lord bless you, the Lord keep you, make his face shine upon you, and be gracious unto you, right? So that's the one that they would do over the tribes. Numbers 7, we have dedicatory gifts of princes that they, and then directions for placing the golden lamps of the tabernacle. So now we're getting into how to deal with the furniture, the consecration of the Levites themselves. We have our second Passover, right? And then the supplemental Passover, right? After it, we have a cloud and the tabernacle. It comes down onto the tabernacle, and then the silver signal trumpets. So trumpets were how they announced things, and depending upon what the trumpet played, that depended upon whether it was a call for a meeting. They didn't have social media or loudspeaker systems, but the trumpet players would go up, they'd play a particular tune, and that would announce whether it was a call to war, call to meeting, beginning of the Feast of Trumpets, and they had different ones for each. It's like when I was in the military, you have they played taps at a funeral, revelry in the morning, retreat at night, and so different just different trumpet, I guess, songs, if you will. So this was the first, right? So now in the journey, we have what we had talked about in the first march, right? The beginning of the march from Siani, right? Because they had been encamped there from when they came out of the land until Numbers 10. Hobab invited by Moses in Numbers chapter 10. Then the 3 days march, the chant of Moses, the events at Kirbrath Hartava, right, with the rebellion, the sedition of Miriam, right? Miriam is punished, and then they go from Hazeroth to Kadesh in chapter 12. The spies are sent in 13. The cowardice of the Israelites is seen in chapter 14. The minority report of Caleb and Joshua in chapter 14, right? They're the only ones that had faith, and they were rewarded for it when they finally got to the land. The excision of Israel threatened and averted. In other words, God said to Moses, hey, if you want to, we can start all over here. And Moses said, no, because Lord, what will happen? You redeem them out, and what's going to happen? All the surrounding tribes that are seeing all this stuff happen, people know what's going on here. This is a big deal, and we want you to be always viewed as keeping what you had said. Now, there would have been nothing wrong with that, because he would have still had Moses, right? Still a Jew and all that. However, if God wanted to start a whole nother nation from Moses, though technically that would have worked, it was not really the ideal, and I think it was more of a training for Moses. There's a formal sentence of exclusion from those that were unfaithful, disobedient. The fate of the spies are given. Everybody's upset about that. And then the presumption of people are punished because they wanted to try to go. They said, oh, no, now we'll go back into the land. Well, God's not in it now. And then they got their hats handed to them. So chapter 13 to 19, right? This is what we're talking about here. And in chapter 15, we have the supplementary altar ritual. In chapter 15, the presumptuous sin is irremissible. In other words, it is presumptuous sins are not forgivable under the law. They have the mnemonic fringes, the rebellion and destruction of Korah and his company in chapter 16. Memorial censers in 16. Again, this is all surrounding how God is establishing Aaron as the high priest. The murmurers, the plague, the atonement in chapter 16. And then the priesthood of Aaron accredited in chapter 17, right? His rod budded. The priests and the Levites, right? Their obligations and rights in chapter 18. The preparation of the water of separation in 19. The use of the purifying water in chapter 19. And then we get to our second journey. So here we are into chapter 20 and 21. We're journeying up to Moab. So this is the journey, right, that we talked about. And the detail, they arrive at Kadesh in chapter 20. They need water. This is where Moses strikes the rock. They need a passage through Edom. They are requested but refused. Now, again, if you were to look on a map, as a matter of fact, let me go back to this map here. So if you look at the map, if you see Edom on the right, you see Edom, Moab, right? The land of Midian and all that. They need to move through that area of Edom and Moab. And as they are, that's where they have to deal with Sihon and Og, right? They basically say, listen, can we just walk through? We're not going to take anything. We're not going to, ruin anything. We just need passage. And they were attacked. So then we have the journey to Mount Hor, the death of Aaron in Numbers 20, the defeat of the Canaanite king of Arad, right, in chapter 21, the compassing Edom via the Red Sea in 21, the fiery serpents and the brazen serpent in chapter 21, right, where the brass serpent was put on the pole. They continued the itinerary in chapter 21. They had the victory over Sihon and Og in chapter 21. And the first message to Balaam in chapter 22. This is where Balak, the king of Moab, sends a message to Balaam saying, hey, if you'll come and curse Israel, I'll pay you some money. Well, God told him, he asked God, and God said, no, don't go. And the second message, and then Balaam was received. Now, between the first message, the second message, Balaam goes. God said, okay, go. In other words, I told you the first time, you didn't like that answer. They sweetened the deal with more money, and so then you wanted to go. That's fine. You go. But you only say what I tell you to say. Now, obviously, God saw something in Balaam that needed to be dealt with, and so that's where it talks about Balaam's donkey stopping 3 times. On the third time, Balaam starts beating the donkey, and then God speaks to the donkey, and the donkey says, what are you beating me for? Now the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the pathway with a drawn sword, but Balaam didn't see the angel until God opened his eyes, and he was warned again, do not say anything other than what I tell you. And so Balak's sacrifices and Balaam's first 2 prophecies, they are preparatory sacrifices, Balaam's first prophecy and the second prophecy, which are actually excellent prophecies. So it shows you God can not only speak through a dumb donkey, but he can also speak through a prophet that is in rebellion. And more than that, is seen in the New Testament as a false prophet because of his love for money. So he defined himself in that way. So we walk through this. We come to the last section, right, which again we talked about. And the detail is we have Israel's happiness in 24. The third prophecy by Balaam, the fourth prophecy by Balaam, and Israel is seduced into idolatry. We don't find out till later how that happened. We see it, but then we don't find out how they ended up deciding to do that. So the idolaters are punished, right? This is the thing with Phinehas, right? He's rewarded with an everlasting priesthood because he was in the Levitical tribe. There's a war against Midian that God commands. There's a second census taken. General directions for allotment of Canaan in preparation for when they go in. They do a census of the Levites. The execution of Israel's penal exclusion from Canaan is noted in chapter 26. Now, Zelophehad's daughters, this is an interesting thing that God adds in there because they had no husbands. So the question was, were they going to lose their inheritance? And so they brought it to Moses, and Moses went to God, and God says, no, they're asking for the right thing. In other words, just because they don't have a husband doesn't mean they should lose their inheritance, because normally the inheritance went through that means. But no, it's right that they should get what is in their family, whether they have husbands or not, or brothers or whatever. Moses is forewarned of his death. Joshua is publicly consecrated as his successor, which is important. And then laws of the daily worship and the annual feasts are restated and codified. And then God requires sacrifices. So they have the daily burnt offerings explained, the Sabbath offering explained, the law of offerings at the new moon explained, law of offerings at the Passover. Notice they're all in chapter 28. Offerings at the Feast of First Fruits, the reinstatement of the feast statutes, in other words, the offerings of the Feast of Trumpets, offerings on the Day of Atonement. Now, remember, there are 7 feasts, 4 in the spring, which are Passover, unleavened bread, which really kind of go together, first fruits, and then Pentecost. And then the fall feasts start with the Feast of Trumpets, then it's the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Tabernacle. And so they're explaining each of the sacrifices that go with them. The sacredness of vows. People should not vow, just to make a vow. God wants them to think about their vows because they need to pay them once they make them. In other words, a lot of these vows were to him. The maid's vow, the betrothed wife's vow, the vow of the widow and of the divorced wife. So they get pretty specific. So that's why the time is spent to explain these, because they all mean something. It's interesting. When we get married, we make a vow. And isn't it interesting? We vow to love one another until death do us part. The good, the bad, right? Sick, health, all this. Well, when I was a little kid in the 60s, I'll never forget, my mom was talking on the phone to her friends, and they were just astounded at the fact that in California they come up with no-fault divorce, which basically was for irreconcilable differences. So, and this was not something initially that was well accepted, but eventually, a lot of things start in California and then they spread back here east. But the idea that you could just divorce somebody because you just wanted to was shocking. Okay. I mean, those of you who are old enough that remember like some of the 1950s TV shows, they're all in black and white. I remember, I used to watch Perry Mason all the time as a kid. It was a black and white, he was a lawyer. And as a little kid, I would always see they would hire people, if they thought their spouse was committing adultery, they had to hire a private investigator to take pictures and catch them in the act so that they could go to court and get a divorce. Because other than that, there was no grounds for a divorce. And then the 60s hit in California and everything was off. So off to the races in the wrong direction. But anyways, the point is, up until that time in the 60s, really a lot of American law and everything really followed the course of the Bible, because it really was, um, you know, divorceable offense were adultery, obviously, violence, right? It's tough to get along with somebody that's trying to kill you. Okay, there are a lot of other laws that come into effect then too, but you know, the the point I guess I'm trying to make is that um, we do not really respect vows today. And the church does not respect vows. The divorce rate among Christians is pretty close to the world. Um, and I mean, it's sad. It has caused a damage to the church that um, is is not really quantifiable in a sense. On a graph you can kind of see it, but you know you can only quantify it so much. But the moral effects of it, and the breakup of the families and everything. Now look, if you were divorced, and I don't want to condemn you, and that's not my intent. I'm talking about vows. But people need to realize when they make a vow, they're vowing for that reason. I mean, think about it. I'm going to love you, which is a choice. It's not a feeling, and that's part of the problem. People think love is what Hollywood talks about as opposed to what the Bible teaches, right? Love is from the Bible, right? God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So love is giving, love is sacrificing for the benefit of the one that's loved, right? So it doesn't always feel good, but it's really founded in commitment. You're making a commitment to somebody. And um, I'm not saying that it's easy to do, but that's what it is. And so when you make a vow, especially a marriage vow, and that's why, like, we bring couples through premarital classes to try to explain to them, like, this is what you're getting into. Like you need to realize this is not extended dating until you get tired of the person. This is what it is for the rest of your life. So if you're going to say for good and bad, sickness and health, that means that, we're not talking about adultery and things that would break that vow. But what we're talking about is if you make a vow, um, then you can't just turn around and say, you know what, the vow was good, but I don't feel like I love you anymore. I love somebody else I found, so I'm just going to I'm just like, we're not in the vow anymore. It's like, how does that work? Like, it was never really a vow. Like, a vow is like I'm going to do this. So if you're vowing yourself to somebody else in marriage and you're a Christian, please remember that you're to fulfill that vow before God. You're making the vow before God, and He takes it serious, so you should too, right? But anyways, as we move on, the vow of the wife, right, and then the conquest of Eastern Palestine, right? I hate the term Palestine, but it's the land of Israel, right? Midian is conquered, Balaam is slain, and this is on the east side where Moab is. The treatment of prisoners, right? You can't mistreat them. Soldiers, prisoners, spoils are ceremonially cleansed, and they're dealt with properly. The allotment of spoils, how it's broken up, because when you went to war, you basically, when you conquered a people, you took their stuff. You got to figure out what to do with it. Everything needs a decision. Free will thank offering to Jehovah in 31. The allotment of Eastern Palestine, right, for Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe Manasseh. Like what that even means. This is where some of the problem came in. The remonstrance of Moses, and then the modified petition of Reuben and Gad in Numbers 32. Again, this was part of the problem of them staying on the outside, but it got rectified. The petitions granted. They were allowed to stay on the outside. They come in. Numbers 32, 33, that's where, Moses said, you can be sure if you don't fulfill what you're saying, your sin will find you out. The itinerary of the Israelites in 33, the command to exterminate the Canaanites and to distribute their land to the Jews, right? The boundaries of the promised land are given. The commissioners for distributing the land, right? The Levite cities, there was 48 of them. Cities of refuge, there was 6. There was 3 in the land and 3 outside of the land, where Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe Manasseh were. Those were cities where those 6 were Levite cities where Levites lived. And if you killed somebody by accident, you could flee to that city. They were geographically dispersed, and you could stay there, and people could not take retribution on you. Now, obviously, they would investigate to make sure it was accidental, right? It was manslaughter, but people could not take revenge out on you and kill you, right? And then you were free to leave that city at the death of the high priest. A lot of symbolism there for the New Testament. But then the international manslayer is part of that, and then the marriage of an heiress. So, bouncing back to the command to exterminate the Canaanites, from the time of Abraham, knew of the God of Abraham, and they knew that the land was going to be given to them. They knew all the stories. God gave them from the time of Abraham, through his life, that time, Isaac's life, Jacob's life, into the land of Egypt for 400 years. Moses takes them out. They go in. What does Rahab the harlot say when they come to Jericho, the very first city? We heard all about you guys. They knew, everybody knew about Israel. They heard about all their victories. They knew what God was doing with them. They had a reputation. And yet, only Rahab and her family were spared by faith. Now, it's interesting because when Noah got off the ark, people could not just murder people, right? Because people are made in the image of God. And the Canaanites were sacrificing children. I mean, they had just awful practices. They were pagans, right? They were everything from cannibals to just the worst and most immoral practices you can imagine. That's what they were doing. And listen, to kill your own baby after it's born, and some of them, burn them alive, to Molech, it's unconscionable. They were like animals. But the death penalty was upon those who committed murder. God had given them, and he said he was going to give them time. He said to Abraham in Genesis 15, your offspring is, that he didn't have any yet, was going to go down to Egypt for 400 years and everything. He said, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. In other words, God was giving time morally for these people to repent, but they didn't. They got worse and worse and worse and worse. And then he used Israel, who didn't even know these people, basically as a capital punishment instrument. So the Jews they didn't even know these people, right? But this was God's usage of them for that. So a lot of people say, well, who do the Jews think they are? Well, it was God that did it. Now, God could have struck them all dead, right? Like in a nanosecond. However, he said, I'm bringing you into a land, cities you didn't build, farms you didn't, plant, vineyards you didn't plant, cattle you didn't raise, the whole thing, okay? So God was bringing them in there, but he said, I'm going to give you the land little by little, otherwise the animals will take it over. So God was providing the land for the Jews. Now, in the meantime, if people repented and they wanted to be part of Israel, they were the strangers that were allowed to come in. However, there wasn't a lot of that. And so this extermination was really a means of capital punishment, which a lot of people like to pick on the Bible. Oh, look at God used to, you know, it's like they're like Islam. They just go kill people. No, nothing like Islam. Is the Quran teaches that people that are not Muslims should be killed. The Bible deals with moral issues. They were not killed because they were non-Jews. They were killed because they were murderers. Okay, and they were committing idolatry and murdering, which both of them from the Garden of Eden were not allowed. Okay, so murder was made clear in Genesis 9, and then God judged again in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel. Idolatry was a judgment as well as murder, and they were committing both, with a ton of other, sins in between. But that's not the point. The point is, there's a very specific reason, and judgment is the last course that God takes, especially in situations like this, where in the Quran it's the first. But I do a whole presentation on that you can watch. But anyways, next time we'll get into Deuteronomy. We're getting close to an hour. These are taking longer than I expected, but we'll talk about that next. So until next time, hopefully this is helpful as an overview, that you can actually dig into numbers and kind of claw out some of the details that we're talking about. Amen. So until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.